Welcome to the People Planet Profit podcast. I'm Hayley Jarick, CEO of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and today I'm joined by the chair of the Supply Chain Sustainability School's board, Mr. Ricky Bridge. Ricky has over 20 years' experience in senior environment and sustainability leadership roles in both the government and private sector. Ricky is experienced in corporate governance, leading high-performance teams, external assurance, and several sustainability and environmental areas, including sustainability reporting, finance and tools, and environmental decarbonisation, planning assessments, approvals, management systems, auditing, due diligence, impact assessment, risk assessment, and project management. Welcome, Ricky.
Thank you, Hayley. Happy to be here.
It's always fun to have your bio read back out to you and you politely sit there and hear all of your achievements being put out there. Thank you so much for spending the time in joining us today. So we're going to basically take all of the listeners through some radical collaborations to look at supply chain impacts, sustainability impacts specifically. And I know that we sort of term them as sort of scope 3. So perhaps probably the best place to start is if you could take us through those definitions of, for those that don't understand, what are scope 1, 2, and 3 areas?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about carbon accounting, there is 3 scopes of emissions: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So starting with scope 1, this is an organisation's direct emissions, and typically relates to the combustion of liquid fuels such as diesel, or petrol, or natural gas, or different variations, or different other sources of gases. So these are what we call as our scope 1 emissions. This is where they are combusted directly from the organisation. Scope 2 emissions refers to indirect emissions, and most typically they are electricity. So this is whereby a fuel source is combusted in a centralized location, whether it be a gas generation plant or a thermal coal generation plant, as we see most of in Australia. And thereby, by turning on your lights, you're consuming that. The organisation consumes that energy, but the actual combustion takes place somewhere else. So this is what we call our indirect emissions. And then scope 3 emissions refers to everything other than scope 1 and 2. And for most organisations, that sits within in our procured goods and services that we procure.
Excellent. So then if we jump straight into talking about, well, what are the impacts that can come in from that scope 3 area? And if we broaden the topic of not just those environmental and carbon impacts, but sustainability on a whole, what type of impacts can that area have on a business?
Oh, there can be several impacts, and it is a really challenging area for organisations to manage, and that includes issues like modern slavery. It includes social issues, right through the supply chain, as well as just the actual accounting and being able to support, influence, and manage the scope 3 emissions that comes from our suppliers and subcontractors.
Excellent. And so if we're going to talk about we could, if we were going to sit here and talk about all scope 1 and 2 and 3, all sustainability, we could literally be here for weeks trying to talk through all of that. So if we kind of just hone the conversation down to that scope 3 area of a business, let's talk about just around collaboration to achieve areas in that space. So if you can talk us through sort of maybe how you've seen others sort of tackle those scope 3, and we'll start off with the carbon greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I think, Hayley, it's the journey in terms of collaborating. It has certainly increased, and it's rapidly increasing. But I think there's more willingness for suppliers and organisations to engage on topics like scope 3 emissions, as well as modern slavery. And we see that you take a very similar approach to both those issues, or any sort of whether it be scope 3 or human rights issues. It's a similar approach, and so I guess it all starts with a conversation. It also starts with having a common understanding of, for instance, scope 3 emissions and what that entails, and why the why for why we're trying to collaborate and report on these emissions. And it's like that's saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. So being able to have an accurate and consistent, reliable measure of those Scope 3 emissions sets the foundation and the platform to have that engagement and that conversation. I think another thing that we're seeing is the net zero targets. So by setting net zero targets or net zero commitments is establishing again that common platform or that common goal that everyone's trying to achieve. And we know we can't do it together. We have to collaborate. We have to work in partnership. And for organisations like Downer, our supply chain is critical to us in decarbonising our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
Excellent. And so if we talk, so I think the industry numbers are around if you looked at all of your emissions added up, 80% comes from Scope 3. So it's a massive area to be able to tackle and to be able to get on there. And you spoke briefly then about you measure what you've got and then start those communication channels to be brought up. But I suppose one of the first hurdles you'll come across when you start to talk about this is that, I suppose you're very lucky that Downer has a lot of resources that they can allocate to this, or probably you could always do with more resources, right? But I mean, comparatively, compared to your some of the members within your supply chain, you would definitely have more resources, either human, monetary, everything to be able to throw at this. So what are some of the challenges that you come across when you start to have that conversation with Scope 3, and how have you look to tackle to address them?
Yeah, so some of the challenges I think is the data itself and the integrity of the data. Again, it's the common understanding. So having the conversations with the right people within those organisations. Now, Downer we have signed up with the CDP supply chain program to support us in assessing our Scope 3 emissions, and that's been really helpful in terms of opening up the doors and opening up the conversations with our suppliers. And in conjunction with the CDP, we advocate for the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So this is our second year on the CDP supply chain program. We just held a supplier webinar only 2 weeks ago as the survey's open now for FY22. And it's during that webinar and that engagement is where we provide information on the Supply Chain Sustainability School. We encourage our suppliers to either sign up as a fellow or to access the various resources that exist on the school. And we find that's a really good engagement because it really it opens up an opportunity for them to go and do their own learning, their own self-paced research and learning on the topics and coming back to us. So therefore, when we're having these engagements with the suppliers, it's a lot more informed and we get a lot more out of it. So I think the two pieces there is the understanding, the knowledge, and then obviously then we can help and support them with the data. And a lot of our suppliers are other people's suppliers. So the challenging thing is around how do those suppliers assign their Scope 3 emissions or their emissions that relate to the work they do or the tasks they perform for Downer. And so through the CDP supply chain program, there's some methodologies, and we can support those organisations in how they go about allocating those emissions to ensure that we're getting accurate and reliable data.
That's excellent. And then broadening out from just the carbon data, then maybe talk to us through about how you're tackling modern slavery through your supply chain.
Yeah, so I guess for Downer, we've done like all organisations, we've done a risk assessment based on the categories and the services that we procure, the country of origin, and really, Downer is about 97% of our spend is local in Australia and New Zealand. Now we know that the supply chains go a lot deeper than that, but all in all, we again, it's through those engagements with those suppliers, right through from our pre-qualification process to ongoing engagements. And we're seeing much more, like there's more and more ESG issues relevant to both of us that we're having these conversations on, talking about, certain products, asking questions, working with the supply chain, getting them to verify and validate with evidence what they're doing to manage the next layer down in their supply chain. So they're just some of the common things that we're doing. My team in particular works closely with our procurement team. So we're starting to see the more traditional environment sustainability teams within organizations, collaborating and working more closely with some of the other functional areas. So when it comes to modern slavery, we work very closely with procurement, as well as our company secretary and legal team.
Excellent. And then in terms of other, like I said, you spoke about broader ESG or environmental social governance issues more broadly within the organisation, but what sort of things are you getting asked from your customers to sort of track through that scope 3 area, say whether it's you're trying to get a IS rating or just other contractual obligations around social, environmental or economics? I mean, there's a lot of sort of local procurement targets and things. What are sort of things are you being asked for from that area?
Yeah, so we're seeing definitely a more increasing. We're getting a lot of questions around, like right now, Downer doesn't have a Scope 3 greenhouse gas emission target. So from the investors, we're getting a lot of questions around, what's Downer doing in this space. In saying that, though, we are getting closer, and we're one of very few companies in our sector that have gone out and done a comprehensive Scope 3 assessment and signed up and leveraged off the CDP supply chain program. So we have data for FY20. We disclosed data for FY21. We're in the process of doing our assessment for this year's sustainability report. And off the back, we'll have 3 years worth of data that we will be able to monitor and assess, and therefore look at what rather than going out with a target and then deciding, okay, now we've set that target, how are we going to meet it? What we tend to do is we like to look at the data, and we like to see what the trends are. We then look to see what is within our sphere of control and influence and what we can actually do. Develop a Scope 3 decarbonisation plan, and then set targets accordingly to that. So, and in doing that, we'll align to the Science Based Target Initiative's methodology. So that's our approach. We're also getting, I guess, a lot more questions from our customers, especially around on our infrastructure projects, around the embodied carbon in the materials that we're using, and looking to lower, obviously look for low emission sources of materials, and looking at where we can lower our impact on those projects. So there's just some of the common ones, I guess, that we're starting to see coming through from both the investor and the customer base.
Excellent. And so if I was a supplier, either looking to supply to Downer or someone else within the industry, I know we've spoken a lot on carbon, embodied carbon, modern slavery. What other ESG issues should be on my radar?
Other ESG issues on your radar? I think circular economy. So what we're doing with waste and single-use plastics. I think that is a key one that we're certainly looking at with our supply chain. I think other forms of human rights issues. I think local content, Indigenous spend, and Indigenous supplier and engagement, and supporting those local Indigenous businesses. We'd also see diversity and inclusion, and gender equality.
Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up the podcast for today?
No, I guess, if anyone's out there listening, I just encourage you to log on to the Supply Chain Sustainability School, take a look at all the fabulous resources that are available, and use them to your advantage.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ricky, for joining me.
Not a problem, Hayley. Happy to be here. All right, enjoyed it.
And until our next episode, bye.